Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Kianistan podcast. I'm very pleased to say, joining us today, we have Jean-Daniel Rouge. Jean is an ex-Swiss ambassador. He retired recently after serving his country for many decades. And in that time, he got to work across some of the most demanding fault lines in geopolitics. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine. Before we start, would you mind maybe taking a bit of time to just tell us a bit about your background, some of the places, the assignments you've worked on?
Well, yes, I think the highlights of my careers have been at the beginning to work on a European security system following the fall of the Berlin Wall in the 90s.
Oh, wow.
And the whole story there was how to bring Russia into a new European security architecture. We failed, as can be seen from what is happening now, which is not so easy, but and then the other highlights has been my work for the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where we prosecuted the main people responsible for the crimes, and including the genocide of Srebrenica against Bosniak Muslims in 1995. And we prosecuted successfully those criminals. So I worked for the UN for a while, and that was very satisfactory. Maybe that was the highlight of my career. And then I served mostly on the Middle East. I special envoy of Switzerland for the Middle East in the times where a two-state solution was still something tangible, possible, even probable. And then I moved as ambassador to Serbia and then ambassador to Israel. And my last posting was ambassador of Switzerland to Turkey.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
And now I stopped 2 years ago. And now I'm teaching in some universities. I'm giving conferences, courses. And last but not least, I wrote 2 books. One of them, which is very much about geopolitics based on my experience. You can find it on Amazon if I can make a little bit of advertisement.
Yes, please do.
It's called Crimes, Hate, and Tremors. And it's about all the things I've been through, talking about justice, Europe's or the West double standards, and our efforts to bring peace in the Balkans and in the Middle East.
Please do share a link with me as well for the Amazon, and I'll put it in the show notes for anyone who's interested. They can kind of access your books more easily.
Okay. I can share later if you.
Yeah, we could do that after the recording. That's fine. Thank you so much. So, Ambassador, talking about Ukraine, would you agree? It seems like for someone like me, a layperson, it just seems like one of the biggest failures of diplomacy, because it seems like it was such an avoidable conflict that never should have gone this far. How do you see it?
Yes, actually, that was the trigger to start to write my book. I was in Ankara in those days, and I had 2 tremendous rises of blood pressure. The first one was on the 22nd February, or 20 February, when Russia invaded Ukraine, which in my view fits the legal definition of an act of aggression according to the definition given by the International Criminal Court's Rome Statute. And I was like, my goodness, how come was it not possible to prevent this war from happening? And we know there were talks and proposals from Russia in December 2021 that were ignored by the West. So I think the blame can really be shared, but we will know later when all the archives will be open on how these mechanics developed and led to this invasion. So that was really my first big rise of blood pressure. And the second one was in April when the talks collapsed. Because maybe we have forgotten now after all these years, but there was a real chance to stop the war at the negotiating table just 6 weeks after it had begun. And as the representative of Switzerland, a neutral country, in Turkey, we were at one point associated to the discussions to invent a model of neutrality for Ukraine, because that was one of the key demands from Russia, was that Ukraine would be a neutral state. And of course, having a Swiss involvement with the reputation of Swiss as a neutral state would have added credibility and legitimacy to a neutral status for Ukraine. And the negotiators, the mediator, the Turkish mediator, but then I had the chance also to meet the Ukrainian negotiator in those talks. They told me that indeed there was a text that had been approved by Putin himself, but then the West apparently thought that it was too early to stop the fighting. And we heard the defense secretary of America in those days, Lloyd Austin, saying, first we have to weaken Russia. So there were other strategic objectives, seemingly, than stopping the conflict. And of course, I've been in many conflicts. I have seen the sufferings. I've seen the results of the bloodshed. I've seen how difficult it is to rehabilitate physically and psychologically a nation that has gone through such a trauma as is now happening in Ukraine. And I could foresee the very long-term consequences of the continuation of the war. But thanks God, now it seems that there are, let's say, constructive negotiations which are taking place under American mediation. And I think we are all praying for this war to stop as soon as possible.
You're so right, Ambassador. It seems like you're absolutely right. Equal blame or some blame could be placed on both sides, or all three sides, which is like Russia, Europe, and USA. But the biggest tragedy is for Ukraine. And it just seems like Ukraine also has equal or a lot of blame that can be placed on Ukraine. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but Ukraine had a very good opportunity to just be a neutral state from beginning and benefit from good relations from both sides rather than trying to be in one camp or the other. Why did Ukraine not take that opportunity? Did they not see this path that they're going down?
Well, I think that after the Maidan revolution in 2014, Ukraine has become the object of a zero-sum game. And it looked like a compromise was not possible. The kind of compromise that I think the Russians would have wanted, which is that Ukraine be a kind of buffer zone between NATO and Russia. I think this was also a bit the sense that presided over the Minsk agreement that put an end to let's say, the first part of the war back in 2015. But, I mean, the Russian narrative, and really, again, we will see when we have access to all the documents, the Russian narrative is that the Minsk agreement was never really implemented by the Ukrainian side. Obviously, there were also violations on the Russian side, from what I hear. But they were never serious, and this has been confirmed by Merkel, even Merkel, and the French president, the then French president François Hollande, who were the guarantors of the Minsk agreement, that there was never really a serious pressure attempt to put in place some of the provisions of the Minsk Accords. And actually, that this sort of pause was used to refurbish, strengthen the Ukrainian military. In other words, from the Russian perspective, they could see that the West used the Minsk agreement to increase their footprint, to increase the NATO, their military, and also intelligence presence in Ukraine, and that was deemed unacceptable by Russia. And I think that was really the motivation, let's say, or the reason why eventually Russia took this very dramatic step. But you're right. This was a missed opportunity, and I think it is because on both sides they went into a win-lose situation or win-lose game instead of trying to look for a win-win game. And the win-win game became very difficult. Also, we have to remind that from the moment that Russia annexed Crimea, because it was pretty obvious that they would never come back from this annexation.
Yeah.
And from there, the conflict evolved, as we have seen, and now probably what is going to happen is that Ukraine will be divided into two spheres of influence. Russian is the Donbas region in the east, and a pro-Western with NATO-like security guarantees from Western countries in the West. This is the likely outcome now. And I think it is a missed opportunity, because I do believe it is a very bad signal for other states which are in this kind of geographical location. Because I do believe that neutrality is a powerful instrument to prevent two countries or two powers to get in direct contact. It's a bit like oil in mechanics, if you want. It prevents the mechanic to rub and to heat and to produce some fire. Now, if you look at the geography dominates. The geographical situation in that part of Europe, you could imagine Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and then in the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan as playing this kind of role of buffer zone between NATO states and the Russian Federation, which is a little bit, by the way, if you look at history, the model that was applied after the Napoleonic War. I don't know if people remember the Napoleonic War that ended in 1815. And in 1815, the big powers who won that war, and Russia was one of them, very instrumental. They went all the way to Paris, the Russians back then. They had this vision, let's do a buffer zone between France and the German monarchies to prevent the French Revolution to be exported. And that's why Switzerland's neutrality was recognized by the powers, because they thought that to have this line of buffer states would be something good for peace. And actually, the system worked more or less until the First World War.
Yes, all right. It's similar how the Russian Empire and the British Empire were both kind of together formed a buffer zone of Afghanistan between the two, so that there isn't a direct conflict. So they understood the benefit of this, but now it's just this zero-sum game. But also, I think the biggest tragedy is that Ukraine allowed itself to be used by these powers rather than trying to balance the two things out.
Well, this has to do with the domestic political situation in Ukraine. Ukraine has always been divided in its sensitivities between an eastern part, which was traditionally speaking Russian, closer to Russia, also with family ties, especially in the Donbas, and a western part, which was closer to the European Union and to the West, also in terms of mentality, and also throughout history. I mean, the western part of Ukraine has been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for quite a long time. So these differences were always there. If you look at the electoral map, for instance, of the last time there was an election in a situation which was not a situation of conflict, which was, I think, 2010, and you look at the map and you see the whole East voted for the candidate which was supposedly pro-Russian.
Yes.
And the whole West voted overwhelmingly for a candidate which was supposedly pro-Western. So these divisions were there already. And when you have such divisions, then I think it would have been wise for the great powers, the Russians and the West, to allow this country to stay outside of any sphere of influence. But this was not the mindset, neither in Moscow, nor in Brussels and Washington. And this is a tragedy of this kind of countries, because when you when you do not have this strong national cohesion, then you can be the subject of outside influences. This almost happened to us during the First World War, when the German part of Switzerland was very much pro-German, and the French part of Switzerland was very much pro-French. And thanks God we had the neutrality, which played tremendous role as a factor of national cohesion, and which led us to say, come on, this conflict is not our conflict. It's a conflict between outside powers, and we don't want to have anything to do with that. We want to protect our integrity. Now, obviously, in Ukraine, this is not what happened.
No. Ambassador, so as you mentioned, it seems like there's an effort now finally being kind of a serious effort in place to bring an end to this conflict, which is going to happen by means of negotiation ultimately. But in this negotiated settlement, out of the four players, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, Europe, America, who do you think is the biggest obstacle at the moment to bring this whole conflict to an end?
Well, it's a bit difficult to blame somebody for that. I do believe that the Americans are producing some genuine efforts in a very, I would say, non-conventional manner, because they inject into the talks issues which are purely bilateral Russian-American, for instance, joint drilling for oil in the Arctic and things like that. I think that both the Russians and the Ukrainian leaders, the leaders on both sides, have a lot at stake. And it's about their, especially on the Ukrainian side, their political survival and maybe their physical survival at all. I mean, from the Russian point of view, it's obvious that there is no way they can make big compromises on the Donbass. What they want is that Ukraine recognizes the territories that they occupy as Russian. It is very hard for them to go below that threshold. There may be some ambiguity by saying that we don't recognize the territorial integrity, or we keep to say the territorial integrity of Ukraine remains what it is all the way to the Russian border. But the conflict is frozen for a number of years, and we'll talk about that later, or other things like that. What is clear is that the Russians have always said they cannot accept the formula that had been agreed upon in Minsk, which was a formula of autonomy within the sovereignty of Ukraine. And for the Ukrainians, obviously, it's extremely difficult to accept this loss of territory. I mean, which is a leader who would accept to lose 20% of its territory, which is what the Russians are asking. So I think we have to understand that for those leaders, there is really a lot which is at stake, and these are decisions which are not easy to take, because even in Russia, you are always the representative of a system. And the system on both sides, I think, has pretty high demands, and there are some red lines which are so far not compatible. But on the other hand, also, there are strong demands in the population, I think more on the Ukrainian side, but even the Russian economy is suffering because of the sanctions. So there is a lot of pressure on the leaders also to put a stop to this bloodshed now. And I do believe that at the end, both societies, both nations will be exhausted enough that they will find it that the cost of an agreement will be less than the cost of continuing that war.
True. I was listening to the Russian foreign minister's interview today, where he was talking about how they don't want like a ceasefire without a permanent peace in place between Russia and Ukraine. But the difficulty is that it's very difficult to assure a permanent peace because no one can guarantee how things will pan out in the future. And And I think that's kind of where one of the difficulties are. And then on the other hand, Europeans are still talking about as soon as there's a ceasefire or there's a kind of cease in conflict, whether that's through a peace settlement or a ceasefire, that NATO forces will come to Ukraine to upkeep that peace, which is kind of ridiculous if they're still talking about that at this stage in the whole process, because that's going to be completely unacceptable to Russia. But ultimately, I think maybe America might be able to assert enough pressure on all sides to bring this to an end, I'm hoping.
Well, I'm not sure what kind of pressure America has towards Russia.
Yeah.
And Lavrov is just repeating what has been the official position of the Russian government for a very long time. No ceasefire, we want a permanent settlement. And a permanent settlement, from their point of view, means Ukraine has to recognize the sovereignty of Russia over Crimea and the Donbass, basically. And that's why it's very difficult on the Ukrainian side. There are some red lines. However, provided they find some kind of ambiguous compromise on these territorial questions, the verification of the ceasefire, or let's say some guarantees that the ceasefire can be maintained, could be the result of two things. On the one hand, to have guarantees from Western powers without stationing troops in Ukraine. I think this is very much the red line which has been expressed in very clear terms by Russia. No NATO troops or no troops from one country which is a member of NATO on Ukrainian territory. But you can have other formulas whereby you could have troops stationed in Poland or in another neighboring country of Ukraine, and there would be an agreement that in case of a new offensive by Russia, then those troops would intervene. Maybe that would be a sufficient guarantee, and actually Russia would not have much to say about that. The second thing, which in my view would be an even better deal, is that there would be some strict provision regarding demilitarization that should start with a no arms, no offensive weapons zone on several dozens of kilometers on each side of the front line. And that this should be combined with a renewed pan-European effort to work on what is now called military risk reduction. Meaning, in the old days, we used to call that the confidence and security building measures. There was a system in place in Europe until a bit before the Ukraine war that worked pretty well. What did it entail? I mean, the purpose of this system was to prevent any surprise attack. And for that to happen, each country in Europe had an obligation to announce in advance each and every movement of troops. Whenever they were doing military maneuvers, they had to invite observers to show that these maneuvers were not offensive or were not threatening. There was even the possibility for any country to seek an inspection with a very short advance notice in case they would have noticed unusual movements of troops. Now, this system of confidence and security building measures has been put in place still during the Cold War in the 80s, and something like that should be reinvented. The second thing that should be reinvented is a treaty on the limitation of offensive conventional weapons in Europe. Again, we had a treaty like that in place, the CFE treaty, which was also negotiated still during the days of the Cold War, which was placing ceilings on the number of offensive weapons, which means fighter aircraft, tanks, artillery, helicopters that were deployed on the NATO side and on the side of the Warsaw Pact. Yeah. I do believe that renewing these talks for conventional arms control in Europe could be part of the whole system of the dispute settlement in Ukraine, and that would really be a huge step towards restoring strategic stability in Europe. And then there is the other element, which is more bilateral Russian-American, which is the nuclear stability. As we know, the last valid treaty between the US and Russia has expired just a few days ago, the New START treaty. And it would be also urgent to restart the nuclear talks between the two biggest nuclear powers. So framing the agreement, framing the peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine in regional security agreements and in global security agreements, nuclear agreement, I think would be the best scenario. But as we know, the best scenarios over the past year have rarely been implemented. But let's see, maybe we have wiser people now.
Well, one would hope. There's a seemingly a big rift opening up between Europe and America in terms of the security umbrella that was offered from USA, and Europe may have to fend for itself going forward, which is a big challenge. But surely that also represents some kind of an opportunity to improve relations between Europe and Russia.
Maybe. I think there are many other things that will have to happen for the relations between Europe and Russia to improve, starting with the sanctions, because this is really so the sanctions for me is the most important thing. No, I think for Europe to regain a strategic autonomy will be very difficult, because since 1945, Europe has been relying on the US for so many things. It's not just military hardware. It is the whole procedures which are NATO compatible. It is the intelligence, the command and control. So to build an autonomous and independent capacity will take really a long time and will require a very strong political power. Because what we are doing now in Europe is basically buying American systems for so many aspects of our military capability. Now, of course, if you rely on the American military industry, and certainly Washington under Trump doesn't want that the Europeans rely less. They want the Europeans to buy more American equipment. That's also why they are pushing for Europe to increase its military spending. So I'm not really sure we will ever manage to have a real strategic autonomy for Europe. The other problem with the strategic autonomy is that you need a more unified political leadership to decide on the doctrine. When would you use your forces? What are the key interests? What are the vital interests that would require? So is Europe really capable of developing these types of power politics? And do we want that after the experience of colonialism and imperialism? Well, these are really question marks.
Yeah.
Another aspect of this is that, yes, Europe is suffering a lot from the sanctions. And the result of all this may well be that in 2, 3, or 4 or 5 years from now, we will have a different political landscape in many European countries. AfD is now in the polls the first political party in Germany. The polls seem to suggest that the successor of President Macron in France will also come from this nationalist movement, which traditionally have been rather closer to Russia. Some people even pretend that they have received money or funding from Russia. AfD is openly saying that we should restore links with Russia, and that the sanctions were not a good idea. So the strategic landscape may change very rapidly over the next 3 or 4 years. No, nobody would have expected that the re-election of Trump would produce such rapid changes in the strategic landscape. God knows what will happen in Europe. We live in very uncertain times in Europe.
So true. Ambassador, thank you so much. I want you to also now, if you allow, shift gears and move from Europe to Middle East, because you have a lot of experience in the Middle East as well. And I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on the current tensions going on between Israel and Turkey. How significant are these, and how long-lasting do you think this might be? What's at the core of what's going on between Israel and Turkey at the moment? Is it what's happening in Gaza? Is it what's happened in Syria?
I think yes, but there are longer-term dynamics there that we have to understand to see how those two powers, Israel and Turkey, which are the two largest and more powerful militaries, armies in that part of the world, are getting closer and closer to a direct confrontation. The first thing is that Israel has used the opportunity, if I may put it this way. I mean, we have to look at that in very cold, blunt terms. I'm very much aware of the terrible suffering of the Palestinian population of Gaza and the West Bank, but also Lebanon, also in Syria. But the blunt calculation is that they used what happened in Gaza to try to destroy this ring of fire that had been patiently built by Iran around Israel. If you remember, before 2023, Israel was potentially confronted with allies of Iran on its western front, Hamas, on its northern, not just Hamas, also Palestinian Jihad, on the northern front with Hezbollah, on the Syria front, so northeast, then in Iraq with pro-Iranian militias, and in Yemen. They have used the war to weaken, they did not destroy, but to weaken seriously any offensive capability of Hamas. They have hit very hard at Hezbollah, and it's unclear now what is left of the capability of Hezbollah. Before 2023, there was a talk that Hezbollah was commanding 150,000 rockets, some with a very high precision. Syria, of course, in Syria, they have used the opportunity of the fall of Bashar al-Assad to extend their control over Mount Hermon, which is the not just the water castle of the region, but also the strategic point, and also to build connection with the Druze community, potentially feeding separatist tendencies there. So their extension, or the extension of their influence, and the fact that they have had military operations all around, was the idea to weaken Iran and to destroy this ring of fire that had been built by Iran, also by cutting the land bridge between Iran and Lebanon through Syria. So that explains the dynamics of why Israel is there to stay and wants to continue to control more territories in Lebanon and in Syria. Then the logic of Turkey is a little bit different in my view. The first reason why they were very much involved in Syria, I believe, is because they see the Kurdish movements who were controlling, with American assistance, the northeast of Syria, were perceived in Ankara as directly related to the PKK. The PKK, which, as we know, has waged an armed
Yeah.
fight in Turkey for many years. But there is something else also. I believe that the fact that both Russia and the United States are disengaging, even if it's still on slow motion, but still have expressed the wish to be less involved as the dominant power to maintain order in the region, has given more freedom of action, but also more responsibilities on the side of regional powers like Turkey. Definitely, Turkey has an interest to have a stable Middle East, and this government in Turkey see its interest to extend its influence and to preserve the order in its immediate neighborhood, which is all the way to Damascus. Plus, of course, we should not forget that those regions have been under Turkish influence in the Ottoman Empire until about 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And this sort of, it's not that Turkey wants to recreate an Ottoman Empire, but it's certainly that they want to extend their sphere of influence, but it's also their national interest.
Yeah.
There is an economic interest, but there is a strategic interest to maintain stability in the regions neighboring Turkey. So I cannot tell you if and when there will be a direct clash between Turkey and Israel. I do not believe that's in the interest of any of those two states. But there is one thing which may be a trigger, and it is the situation of the Palestinians. I do not believe that Turkey could accept to see the plan of the most extremist elements in Israel, meaning the deportation of a large amount of the Palestinian population. I don't think that the Turkish government, and not just the Turkish government, but mainly the Turkish government is stronger than the other governments in the region. I don't think they could accept to see that happening without reacting one way or another. And what we see now, both in the West Bank, in Gaza, it's not yet, in Gaza, the situation, the peace plan proposed by Trump is not really being implemented smoothly. And in the West Bank, we see a dramatic increase in the settler violence that could lead to more destruction of Palestinian houses and a much increased pressure on the Palestinians in the West Bank, either to concentrate in a number of enclaves, or that some people call Bantustans, even though Bantustans in South Africa were much larger than what we see between Tulkarem and Hebron through Nablus and Ramallah,
yeah.
And to allow more settlements to surround these zones of Palestinian population, and of course, putting people in such a kind of open-air prisons increases the temptation or the desire of many people in the West Bank also to leave whenever they can. You know, my friend, I have a close friend who has been observing the situation on the ground from Ramallah for half a decade now, and what she's telling me is, well, you know, if the current trends continue, at the end of the day, the only people who will stay in the region, also on the Jewish side, by the way, are the extremists and the poor people who do not have the means to start a new life elsewhere. Wow. This is very sad.
Very sad, yeah. But Ambassador, do you see an actual risk of a conflict between a kind of kinetic conflict between Israel and Turkey?
Well, as I told you, I think that it is in the interest of none of them. The Israelis have clearly marked their red lines. They have bombed some sites that Turkey was about to militarize, and I think it was pretty clear what the message was. So for the time being, it seems to me that there is a de facto agreement, which is not a verbal agreement, which is certainly not a de jure or side agreement, but a sort of de facto agreement on the division of spheres of influence between Israel and Turkey. The question is really what is going to happen in Syria.
Yeah.
And certainly the Turkish government wants the current government of Syria, which has been, of course, strongly supported by the Turkish government, to re-establish or to establish its control over the whole of the country. And on the other hand, you have the Americans, which are trying to mediate some sort of agreement between the government of al-Julani or al-Shara and the Israeli government. It seems to me that it's too early to say in which direction it will go. But a direct confrontation between Turkey and Israel would trigger enormous costs for both countries. For Turkey, mostly economic costs, because you can be sure that if there is a direct clash between Israel and Turkey, but a real one, and not just isolated incidents, but you can be absolutely sure that there will be a very strong pressure in the American Congress and in Europe to put Turkey on some sort of sanction list. And their economy is very, very much dependent on the West. So I think the Turks will be very careful.
Yes.
From the Israeli point of view, Turkey would be an immense danger because of their military capability. So it seems to me that for the time being, the risk of direct confrontation would be in the interest of no one. Plus, the Israelis have to invest or to use their military assets elsewhere now, and I don't think that Turkey should be or would be a priority. I mean, they have Iran on their plate now, and I think the key priority for Israel now is the situation with Iran.
These two conflicts, Ambassador, what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Gaza, is in many ways changed global politics, geopolitics, things that may have happened anyway, but would have taken a decade. I think it's just kind of happened in the last 2 or 3 years. Now we see Turkey coming closer to Saudi Arabia, maybe considering to join the defense pact between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, which is very interesting. There's also a kind of rift growing now between UAE and Saudi Arabia. UAE getting a little bit closer to Israel. All of these things are having a huge impact on, I think, how global politics, regional politics will kind of unwind in the Middle East. And also, especially what we're seeing, how America seemingly wants to be withdrawing from the region. But on the other hand, they want to attack Iran. So those two things are a bit contradictory, because if there is a conflict with Iran, I think that's going to suck America back into the region rather than exiting. But how do you see this possibility if Turkey does join this pact between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia? How will that make a position in NATO any more difficult than it is?
Well, I think if we look at the root causes of how this has become possible, which would have been unthinkable not so long ago, to see a defense pact between countries which are pretty far away, with no direct borders. So I'm not sure what it would mean in practice either. But each one of them with significant assets. I mean, Saudi Arabia is extremely strong financial assets, plus of course reserves of oil and gas. Pakistan, which is very dynamic growth and the size of its population, and of course the nuclear weapon. And on the other hand, Turkey, which has a foot in NATO, which is also deploying its forces in Syria and elsewhere, which has a very strong military, whose economy is developing rapidly, especially because Turkey has invested over the past decade heavily in the military industry. They are about, they hope they can really produce a fighter jet of the 5th generation in the next, 5, 6, 10 years.
Yeah.
So these 3 powers, with their combined qualities or comparative advantages, would make indeed a very powerful alliance. Now, what does that mean in practice? I'm not 100% sure, because you could see Pakistan and Turkey. Well, you have Iran in the middle. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, you have again Iran in the middle. So if you make a defense pact, usually it is directed against somebody. So in that case, against whom would that defense pact be directed? So for me, this is not completely clear. And of course, you see that those 3 powers are the most important Sunni powers, maybe with Egypt. I'm almost surprised that Egypt is not part of this pact, or whether talks have not yet taken place. So we will see how it develops. But what is interesting is that it would not have been thinkable, I believe, if you had not this withdrawal or weakening of the Western influence that has been there since the First World War as the dominating power, which was sort of keeping the whole region under its control. And that shows that now the regional powers are taking their destiny into their hands, are developing independent, autonomous strategies. This is real autonomous strategy.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia is very interesting. They have close connections to China, to Russia, of course, to the United States.
Yes.
So under MBS, they are truly developing their own foreign policy and security policy based on how they perceive their own interests. So my conclusion for all this is very interesting developments, which reflects the fact that the regional powers are increasingly ready to take into their own hands the problems of their region. But then, on the other hand, in terms of practical impact, except maybe for cooperation on some military industrial projects, that could be one interesting avenue, by the way, for the region. Yeah, I don't really see that this alliance will start to send troops somewhere or to try to destabilize or whatever countries in the region. So for the time being, it seems to me that it is more this kind of alliance which has a very strong political dimension. It's a political signal that may then result in more economic and industrial cooperation. And by the way, if I may add something, Pakistan is also playing a very interesting role, which is sort of new for Pakistan. We were not used to see Pakistan as a major player in the Near East. So Middle East being more around the Persian Gulf, and Near East being more the Levant, so Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine. And now we see that Pakistan increasingly wants to be at the table when you talk about not just the Middle East at large, or Afghanistan, of course, but also about the Near East. And maybe that's an interesting development. And Pakistan is increasingly appearing on the map when it comes to questions of security and stability in the larger Middle Eastern region. Before, we were used to see Pakistan playing an important role in Afghanistan, but not so far away in the West. There is one other aspect which may be interesting in these new developments. It is the appearance of the Balochistan liberation movement, which appeared in Iran as well, by the way. And there is, of course, one question that everybody would like to see answered. And the question is, who is behind, or is anybody behind, or does any outside power support, literally, financially, politically, these separatist movements, and what is the ultimate objective. In the case of Pakistan, I don't know. In the case of Iran, if we see the strategy that has been followed by Israel in Lebanon, in Syria, maybe also in Iraq, it is a strategy of trying to weaken the central government by supporting separatist movements, or let's say competitions towards the central government. Very often this competition would be based on a region with a different identity, like the Kurdish identity. I've been continuing to talk.
Thank you. I'm glad you did.
So I'm saying about the what is the significance of the movement for the liberation of Balochistan, which we have seen appearing in Pakistan and in Iran.
I'm so glad that you talked about that. That is such an important factor at the moment.
And what I see is that in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, Israel and its Western allies have been trying to weaken the central government to favor separate identities like the Kurds, so as to reduce the threat on Israel. There are some observers who are saying this is exactly what Israel would like to happen in Iran. You know, you were asking me about Iran. I have not yet answered.
Yeah.
Definitely, of course, the Israelis and the Americans would love to see a regime change, but Iran is not Venezuela. They cannot just send their troops there, take the supreme leaders, and maybe kill a few military and political leaders, and believe that this will change the attitude of Iran. I don't think this is not the same ball game. So the question you would ask yourself is, what would be the real objective of a military campaign led by Israel or the United States against Iran? The destruction of the nuclear facilities? Well, first they pretend they have managed to do that already in June, so why do you need to do that a second time? So it's not very logical and very consistent. Plus, I'm not sure this is a realistic objective, because as far as I know, whatever remains of the Iranian nuclear program, including the few hundred kilos of enriched uranium, would be very, very hard to reach, so even with the best cluster bombs that the Americans can produce. So this cannot be a very convincing objective. So maybe the objective would be along the lines of what has been tried elsewhere in the region, is to weaken the central state through a massive bombing campaign, decapitating the regime and those forces who are supporting the regime, starting with the Revolutionary Guards, of course, and then supporting separatist movements and other forces like the MEK, the People's Mujahideen, which is more of a leftist, to try to bring some sort of chaos and insecurity. I think that will certainly reduce the threat from an Israeli point of view. Yes. Now, the next question is, are the Americans ready to play that game? For the time being, I don't think so. What Donald Trump would probably be ready to do is a zoom in, zoom out campaign, a bit like they did in Venezuela.
Yeah, ideal case.
But I don't think that anybody can guarantee Trump that such a short, effective operation could produce any sort of result, even if they find a supreme leader. You know, as we know, there is a redundancy built in the whole political and security system of Iran.
Yeah.
And that would not change much. Quite to the opposite, that would probably increase the repression by the regime of any sort of opposition, which I don't think is in the Western interest. And it may even create a solidarity movement among parts of the population who are not very supportive of the current regime. But, when the nation is in danger, you see that there is always a tendency to regroup, under the leadership of the government. So it's very unclear to me what would be the purpose of such a military campaign. And then the other thing is that the question is, are the Americans and the Israeli, do they have the correct assessment of the military capability of Iran? We have seen during the 12 days war in June that Iran has been capable of reaching very sensitive targets in Israel proper. Of course, there have been a cover-up and we haven't heard much about that, but one thing that we have seen is how they targeted the Weizmann Institute, which I know well, because I went there very often also to give conferences and so on. So they have a capability which has probably been increased. The other unknown that the Americans and the Israelis have to factor in is the attitude of Russia and China.
Yes.
Russia and China have been soundingly silent, if you can put it this way, since the beginning of this crisis, the threat, the deployment of what the Americans call an armada. But the silence seems to be combined with lots of cargo aircraft traveling here and there towards Iran, and we don't really know what they have.
Yeah.
We hear, without confirmation, of course, that the Iranians have improved tremendously their air defense capability. Also, their defense on the coast, with missiles targeting the aircraft carrier group that the Americans brought in the region.
Yeah.
That forced, apparently, by the way, the Americans to withdraw their group a few hundred miles to be outside of the range of these missiles. So the consequences could really be dramatic. The Iranians seem to be that serious when they say, we may close the Gulf of Hormuz, we may strike directly Israel, even if it's a zoom-in, zoom-out attack.
Yes.
And of course, the consequences could be dramatic for Trump in the midterm elections. Because the Iranians, it's a bit the weapon of the poor, but they have in their hands the possibility to provoke a dramatic increase of the gallon of oil in America. And as we know, this is very important for the American average citizen who voted for Trump.
Yeah.
So if despite the promises of Trump, the price of the gallon jumps, this would be very bad for the Republican Party in the midterm elections.
Yes.
So hard for me to imagine what would be the smart military move by America and Israel into Iran that would be beneficial to Donald Trump and to the Republican Party for the midterm. And I think from now on, most of the political decisions will have the midterm in mind. So, we know that Mr. Netanyahu is going these days to Washington. I don't know, maybe he has a magic recipe, a magic formula to propose to Trump, but I don't know what it is.
I just don't see it. I'm also wondering, I think any attack on Iran, far from weakening the regime, is going to strengthen it, because it's going to renew the kind of revolutionary ideas, probably be more oppressive for the people inside Iran, like you said, and be a bigger threat for the region. I'm also wondering, for USA, their biggest peer competitor is China. And I was so surprised the way they reacted with against Russia in this war with Ukraine, because ultimately all that's done is brought Russia closer to China and is strengthening China. And similarly, what they're doing in the Middle East is bringing Iran closer to China, is bringing Saudi Arabia closer to China. Even countries like Turkey would be coming closer to China to balance the threats. So this is quite unbelievable. But how do you see, probably my last question now. How do you see the future relations between USA and China developing in the rest of Trump's term? Do you think there's going to be greater conflict? Do you think there's going to be some kind of an understanding of splitting up regions globally?
Well, firstly, to react on how China plays into this U.S.-Iran game. If I would be an American president, my objective would be to regain the dominance over the energy market, is particularly oil market.
Yeah.
Now, one leg of this strategy is to take over the control of the Venezuelan oil production, taking into account that Venezuela possesses the largest proven reserves of oil in the world. A second leg would be to find some sort of arrangement with Iran that would allow the United States to assert some control over the Iranian oil. Russia and China has so far proven either unwilling or incapable of providing the type of investments in the oil infrastructure that Iran needs. And they need huge investments in hundreds of billions of dollars to increase their production. Maybe the United States could promise something like that. And the third aspect, by the way, of this strategy is to try to develop joint project in the Arctic with the Russians. And there we are talking about trillions of dollars of investment. And this is part of the discussions between Russia and the US in the context of Ukraine. So we could see in the first year of the Trump presidency how much he's aware, or he wants US to regain a commanding position on the energy markets. And this is where Iran, in my view, is an important asset. And if the Americans, for the time being, it looks like a crazy idea, but if the Americans one day manage to exert a strong influence on the global oil market, but more specifically on the Iranian ones, that would be, of course, a big move in this competition with China, because as we know, China is utterly dependent on the oil.
Yeah.
One thing that's the first thing. The second thing, it has been not enough noticed, I think, in the world that the United States has published late November, early November, a new national security strategy. Yeah. Which is very different from the Biden national security strategy. It's in many regards, but for me, the two most interesting regards when you look at the global geopolitics is that neither Russia nor China are described as enemies or as threats. China is described as an economic competitor, and with Russia, they say that they have to find again a strategic stability with Russia, which is a reference to the solving the war in Ukraine and to restarting nuclear talks to reach nuclear agreements, I believe. But with China, it is described only in terms of competition. Now, this competition, if it does not evolve towards conflicts, I mean military conflicts, I don't think Taiwan will ever be an American-Chinese war. I think it would seem totally absurd from both sides. But there may be proxy wars for the control of certain resources here and there. And we know how good China has been over the past 25 years to extend its network of influence in South America, in Africa, and so on. However, today, the interdependence, the economic and financial interdependence between China and the US is so big. Come on, the Chinese need a strong American market. Yeah. Of course, China, if it wants, can destroy the dollar by selling all their 600 or 700 billions of treasury bonds that they possess. But then to whom could they sell their products? They need a healthy American market.
Yes.
And then on the other hand, the United States does need China for supplying critical elements like rare earth or rare metals, which are refined in China. Somewhere between 70 and 90% of the production of these critical elements for the computer, IT, telephone industry are produced in China. So they are really dependent from each another, and therefore, and I believe that the Trump administration does realize that now. They did not maybe at the beginning what they played with the 100% tariff, but today is very different, and so that's why I expect rather a sort of positive competition between China and the US.
We should have
for over the longer term. What will be of critical importance is who will acquire the dominance over artificial intelligence.
Yes.
But this is too early, I think, to make a judgment of the impact of these tremendous investments there.
Ambassador, thank you so much. I'm so grateful you were able to cover so many different important topics all in one conversation. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. And thank you for keeping the show going while I was having technical problems. Before you go, Ambassador, if someone wanted to follow your work, I'll definitely take the links for your books and put those into the show notes. Are you on Twitter? Do you have like a blog or anything?
I'm not too much on Twitter. I am a little bit on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook, of course. But maybe I could point also at our own podcast that I record with my friend David Laufer.
Yes.
With interesting personalities. We had Jeffrey Sachs recently, and we have people like that, and we talk about these issues also.
Really?
The name of the podcast that you can find on YouTube is Ruch, my last name, and Laufer, Laufer, and I think this is where you can follow the evolution of our thinking.
Thank you for mentioning that. I'll definitely leave a mention of that in the notes as well. So thank you so much for your time, and I'd love to have you back one day.
Pleasure being with you. All the best.
Thank you. Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs.